In the summer of 1661, a man named Nicolas Fouquet threw a party that left all of Europe speechless. A banquet so extravagant it left a 22-year-old Louis XIV silent for a long moment, not out of admiration, but because he realized his own finance minister was living better than the king. 3 weeks later, Fouquet was arrested. He spent the last 19 years of his life in prison. He died there. Robert Morris, one of America's founding fathers, once the wealthiest man in the new nation, who personally bankrolled the Revolutionary War, died in a cheap boarding house, broke, completely forgotten. Which one of these men was a fool? Neither. They were sharp, well-connected, and powerful. The resources they commanded were beyond what 99% of their contemporaries could even dream of. They just didn't understand one thing. Wealth isn't a straight line, it is a staircase, and the rules on each step are completely different from the one before. My name's Toomey, and I've spent way too much time thinking about the underlying logic of how wealth actually accumulates. Not how to save more, not which stock to buy. But this, why do some people do everything right and still end up exactly where they started? If you have that nagging feeling that no matter how much you save, life never seems to actually get better, then what comes next was written specifically for you. Because you're not doing anything wrong, you just don't know that the rules of this game flip completely at a few critical thresholds, and nobody ever tells you when that happens. Let me take you back to Florence, 1434. The city had a population of about 60,000 people, roughly the size of a mid-sized American town today. But it generated more wealth than kingdoms 10 times its size. The Medici family wasn't born into nobility, they were wool merchants, solidly middle class. Giovanni de' Medici built a modest little bank with no indication whatsoever that his descendants would become popes and queens. But his son Cosimo noticed something that changed everything. Listen carefully, because this is more important than any investment advice you've ever received. Cosimo discovered that capital has a specific threshold. Once you cross it, money behaves in a completely different way than most people understand. Below that threshold, money is defensive. You protect it, hoard it, live in fear of losing it. Every expense feels like a potential catastrophe. You're not building wealth, you're surviving. But once you cross that threshold, you can afford to make mistakes without getting wiped out. You can turn down bad opportunities because you no longer need them. You can wait until something genuinely good shows up. The smaller Florentine bankers didn't have that option. A bad loan came along, they had to take it. A high-risk contract landed on the table, they had to sign it because saying no meant falling behind. But Cosimo could wait. He handed the desperate, ugly deals off to his competitors. He only moved on opportunities where the upside was massive and the downside was limited. His rough estimate, once you have enough capital to survive 3 consecutive years of complete financial ruin, you've entered an entirely different wealth category. And that advantage doesn't grow linearly. It jumps, suddenly, at a specific threshold. It is the difference between checkers and chess. Same board, completely different game. In letters to his family, Cosimo documented 3 lines he had identified. Historians have studied those letters for centuries. He called the first one the breathing line. You've built enough of a buffer that setbacks no longer send you into a panic. The second, he called the multiplier line. Your money starts working hard enough that the growth it generates outpaces what you could spend it on for basic needs. The third was the immortality line. Your wealth can continue growing after you're gone, passing on to your children and their children. By 1513, the Medici family had produced 2 popes, multiple French queens, and controlled more wealth than most European nations combined. But the truly chilling part isn't the Medici rise. It is the families who started from nearly the same position and vanished completely within 2 generations. They weren't wiped out by some sudden catastrophe. No fraud, no theft, no natural disaster. They just slowly disappeared. For one reason only, they had clearly entered the second stage but were still making decisions with a first stage mindset. Or the reverse, they were barely holding on in the second stage but started betting like they were in the third and lost everything. They never updated their mental model when they crossed each line. This isn't a luck problem, it is a cognition problem. And it is exactly the story playing out for you and me, right now, today. So, what does any of this have to do with you? Everything. Because adjusted for the modern economy, the 3 lines Cosimo identified still exist. The numbers have changed, the math and the psychological patterns haven't moved an inch. And almost nobody tells you where those lines actually are. Your financial advisor won't, because these thresholds represent the moment you no longer need his products. Your bank doesn't care, because you being stuck below these lines makes you their ideal customer. Financial media deliberately keeps it fuzzy because keeping you anxious, confused, and clicking is their business model. But I'll give you the actual numbers. Once you see them, the way you think about money will change. The first threshold, $100,000 in investable assets. Notice, not $100,000 in total net worth, not $100,000 after you add up your car, your furniture, your home equity. Investable assets, money that is actually in the market actively compounding. There is something the financial industry will never proactively tell you about this number. Below $100,000, compound interest is basically a lie. I know that stings. Every retirement calculator, every compounding curve chart tells you that even $1,000 can become a fortune through compound interest. Mathematically, yes, the formula doesn't care about the amount. But on the psychological level, in terms of how it actually feels, you won't feel it working until you cross this threshold. Let me run the numbers. You invest $10,000 at an 8% annual return. You make $800 in a year, roughly $66 a month. Less than your phone bill and streaming subscriptions combined. You check your account at the end of the month and it looks almost identical to the beginning of the month. Your feelings don't change, your behavior doesn't change. Compounding technically exists, but it is invisible. 50美元000 Below $100,000, compound interest is basically a lie. At 8%, that is $4,000 a year, $330 a month. Better, but one bad month in the market erases 3 months of gains. You're still anxious. 100美元000 Same 8%, that is $8,000 a year, $666 a month. Now you can actually see it. A rough month might cost you $5,000 on paper. It hurts, but you know it. Or come back. A good month might add $7,000 to $8,000. Your money has started developing its own momentum. Its own personality. It is not just sitting there anymore. It is doing things. But the most important shift isn't mathematical. It is psychological. When the returns your investments generate each year start representing a meaningful percentage of your salary, your relationship with work quietly changes. Say you earn $70,000 a year. Investment returns hit $8,000, meaning 11% of your income is now being created by your capital, not your labor. The handcuffs aren't off yet, but they're starting to loosen. That feeling of desperation, it lifts a little. You start to actually bring up that raise you've been putting off. You start seriously considering that opportunity that might have a better future, even if the pay is similar. The thought of saying no to that terrible team stops feeling completely out of reach. But I'm not going to lie to you. Getting to $100,000 is the hardest stretch of the entire journey. Starting from zero with an average income, this can take 7 to 10 years of consistent saving and investing. 7 to 10 years slow, unglamorous. The complete opposite of the overnight wealth stories you see all over social media. Let me show you what this stretch actually feels like. Investing $500 a month, already a real sacrifice for most people. At 8% returns, your first year, you contribute $6,000. The investment itself grows maybe $200 to $300. You put in $6,000, you get back $6,300. Why bother? This is exactly where 90% of people quit. They do the math, see that the growth is negligible, and tell themselves I'll get serious about saving when I'm making more. Then they buy a nicer car, take a vacation, and 5 years pass. But here is the mathematical reality most people never realize. Going from $100,000 to $200,000 takes roughly half the time as going from $0 to $100,000. Not because you're suddenly saving more, not because you got a raise, but because your money has started making a meaningful contribution to its own growth. $100,000 at 8% grows by $8,000 automatically. Add your $6,000 in contributions, that is $14,000 a year in growth, almost 2.5 times what you were gaining at the start. The snowball finally starts rolling. From $200,000 to $400,000, even faster. And the acceleration reaches a point that feels almost unfair. Let me give you an image you can actually hold on to. You're filling a swimming pool with a garden hose, not a fire hose, not a tanker truck, just a regular garden hose. In the first few hours, you're just creating a puddle. In the first few hours, you're just creating a puddle, implied continuation, but as time accelerates, compound growth fills the pool faster and faster. You walk away for an hour and come back to maybe half an inch of water on the pool floor. It doesn't look like a pool, it looks like a leak. Some of the water evaporates in the sun. You stand there, exhausted, thinking, is this even working? Should I just give up and go inside? That is $0 to $100,000. That is the puddle phase. But once there are a few feet of water in that pool, something shifts. Now when you add water, the level visibly rises. You can mark it on the wall and see measurable progress every single day. The hose hasn't changed. The amount of water you're adding is identical. But the experience is completely different. The people who build lasting wealth aren't necessarily the ones who saved the most or earned the most. They're the ones who made it through the puddle phase. Who kept a hose running even when it felt completely pointless. $500,000 at a conservative 4% withdrawal rate generates $20,000 a year in passive income indefinitely in an expensive city that might not fund luxury, but it covers basic living expenses almost anywhere. The core of it isn't how much you can withdraw. It is the disappearance of fear. When you have $500,000 in the account, you can really be unemployed in the way that word normally means. Get laid off tomorrow. That is a problem, but it is not a catastrophe. You lose your house. You won't go hungry. You don't have to grab the first terrible job you're offered just to stay afloat. You can spend 6 months, even a year, finding the right position. Negotiate from a position of calm, not desperation. That psychological shift is worth more than the $500,000 itself. You've acquired what I call exit capability, the ability to say no to certain things without facing catastrophic consequences. Think about how many people stay in jobs they hate, working for managers who treat them badly, letting those environments slowly erode them from the inside. That is why those managers can get away with it, demanding unpaid overtime, blocking promotions, handing out 2% raises in a 4% inflation environment. They know you can't leave, you know it too. But when you have $500,000, you can leave. You might not want to, you might even love your job. But here is the strange thing, knowing you can leave often makes your job better. You negotiate harder because you're not afraid of the consequences. You set limits because you can afford to. You speak directly in meetings because getting fired isn't the end of the world. When you act like someone who has options, your value as an employee almost automatically increases. And at this point, compound interest starts to feel almost unfair. $500,000 at 8%, $40,000 a year. Think about that number. It is probably more than your annual savings contributions. Right now, your money is your most productive employee. Showing up every day, working 24 hours, no vacation, no benefits, no sick days. Generating $40,000 year after year. At the same time, because you're not desperate, because you're financially stable, you can direct your time, energy, and creativity toward opportunities that don't pay off immediately but might explode later. Your money handles survival, you handle growth. During the 2008 financial crisis, I watched countless people who had built up $500,000 or more in their retirement accounts. They did the saving, they checked the box, the account showed the right number. But they didn't understand what they actually had. When the market dropped 40% and their account went from $500,000 to $300,000, they panicked and sold everything. They turned a temporary paper loss into a permanent, irreversible catastrophe. The market recovered without them. They watched it happen. These people were almost winners right up until the final moment. Why? Because they crossed the second threshold without ever truly understanding what it meant. They had the money but not the matching mindset. They still saw themselves as people who could lose everything at any moment, rather than people sitting inside a fortress. The psychological shift at $500,000 is, at its core, an identity question. Security only works if you actually believe you are secure. Market volatility is noise. Paper losses aren't real losses until you sell. Even through the worst historical downturns, your $500,000 is still there, still compounding, still protecting you. Without updating that understanding, you'll destroy everything you built at the exact moment you most needed to hold on. The third threshold, $2.5 million in investable assets. At this point, the rules of the game flip in the most fundamental way of your entire financial life. $2.5 million at a conservative 6% estimate, far below the historical average of 8%, generates $150,000 a year in passive income. For most people in most places, that exceeds their working salary. Your money earns more than your labor does. You've crossed what I call the inversion point. Before the inversion point, your time is your most valuable asset. Trading time for money makes sense because your labor creates more value than your capital does. Every hour you work generates more wealth than every dollar you've invested. Past the inversion point, that equation completely reverses. Your capital is more productive than your time. Every hour you spend selling your labor is objectively an inefficient use of resources. This is why genuinely wealthy people behave so differently. Not laziness, not indifference to work, they just ran the math. If your portfolio generates $150,000 a year, that is roughly $400 a day, including weekends and holidays. If you go work an 8-hour day and earn $300, you are actually losing money, economically speaking. Wealthy people don't trade time for money because for them, it is an obviously losing trade. Like accepting a currency exchange that pays you half of what your money is actually worth. Getting from $500,000 to $2.5 million almost never happens on salary alone. Even if your income sounds impressive, the math doesn't support it. If you save $50,000 a year, already an impossibly high savings rate for most people. At 8% returns, going from $500,000 to $2.5 million takes roughly 20 years. 20 years, maximum intensity, maximum sacrifice. Most people who actually crossed this line did it through some form of asset ownership. Equity in a growing business, real estate that appreciated significantly, options in a startup that eventually exited successfully, or stock that grew far faster than the market average. This is the most uncomfortable truth about the third threshold. Standard financial advice, save 15% of your income, retire at 65. Is actually designed to get you to the second threshold, not the third. It is engineered to make you feel secure, not to make you wealthy. Security is a tremendous achievement, don't misread me. But if you want to cross the inversion point, you need to change the underlying logic of how you think about building wealth. Now, let me say something most people don't want to hear. There are a lot of people in this system who hope you never understand these 3 lines. Think about who benefits from you not knowing. Banks make money on loans. Every mortgage, car payment, and credit card balance you carry is their revenue and a delay in your wealth accumulation. Credit card companies profit from your balances at 18%, 24% interest. Compounding quietly, eating away at the timeline. It takes you to reach the first threshold. Traditional financial advisors make 1 to 2% commissions pushing expensive actively managed funds. And that 1 to 2%, compounded over decades, quietly shaves off a massive chunk of your eventual wealth. Employers profit from your desperation. When you can't afford to leave, when you need this paycheck so badly, they can demand unpaid overtime, block promotions, give you 2% raises in a 4% inflation year. They know you can't walk, you know it too. Not one of these institutions wants your investable assets to hit $100,000. That is when the handcuffs start loosening. They definitely don't want you at $500,000. That is when you actually have exit capability. That is when you become dangerous as an employee. And $2.5 million, that is the natural enemy of every business model built on financial insecurity. Move 1. Keep your eyes on income, not net worth. Every piece of financial media, every career article, every salary negotiation guide talks about income. Your income is the water flowing through. Your net worth is the water that stays. Someone earning $150,000 and spending $140,000 accumulates less wealth than someone earning $70,000 and spending $50,000. That is not entirely wrong, but it keeps you focused on the wrong metric. But we celebrate the first person and feel sorry for the second. Move 2. Glorify a lifestyle that makes the thresholds permanently unreachable. New car every 3 or 4 years. Buy the bigger house the moment you qualify for the loan. Subscriptions upgraded, phones replaced, lifestyle inflating in lockstep with every raise, the paycheck allocated before it even lands. These consumption patterns aren't accidents. They're the carefully engineered product of industries that profit from your spending, designed specifically to intercept your growing income before it converts into net worth. Move 3, and the most insidious, make the first threshold feel impossible. Getting to $100,000 is the longest, hardest stretch of the entire process. If they can convince you it is not worth trying, if they can make you feel like wealth belongs to the lucky few and has nothing to do with you, you stop playing. Once you stop playing, you're a customer forever. Not a competitor. So, what do you actually do? Starting today. Step 1. Figure out exactly where you stand. Open every account, 401k, IRA brokerage, investment apps, add up everything that is invested in stocks, bonds, index funds, appreciating assets. Don't count your car. It is depreciating. Don't count furniture, your primary home's equity. Set that aside for now. It is complicated and illiquid. We're talking about money you can access without having to sell your house. What is that number? Write it down. Be honest with yourself. This is your starting point. If you are below $100,000, you have exactly one job. Get to $100,000 as fast as possible. No other priorities. You don't need to optimize your US vs international equity ratio. You don't need to research tax loss harvesting or backdoor Roth conversions. Get to $100,000 first. Ruthlessly cut non-essential spending. Go through your last 3 months of transactions and find everything unnecessary. Find ways to increase income. Ask for a raise. Build a side hustle. Sell things you are not using. Automate your investments so the money moves before you can spend it. Put everything into crossing the first threshold. Survive the puddle phase. If you are between $100,000 and $500,000, you've already proven you can build wealth. Now, protect it and let it grow. Build your emergency fund up to 6 months of actual spending, not minimum amounts, actual spending. Check whether your investments are too concentrated. No single company should represent too large a share. And no single sector, either. Then, start asking yourself seriously, if work turned into a nightmare tomorrow, could I walk out immediately? If not, what is the gap, and how do you close it? If you are between $500,000 and $2.5 million, your focus needs to shift to ownership. How do you get equity in something growing faster than public markets? Can a side project be scaled? Can you negotiate equity in your current role? Are there real estate or angel investing opportunities worth considering? The third threshold is rarely crossed on salary alone. The math doesn't support it. You need to start building mechanisms that can actually take you there. If you are already past $2.5 million, congratulations, but be careful. Past the inversion point, the temptation to take on big risks surges. People want to turn $2.5 million into $10 million fast. Start chasing alternative investments, making concentrated bets. The irony is that this is often exactly how people fall back below the threshold, sometimes all the way back to the beginning. Your goal at this stage: protect the position it took you decades to build. Appropriate diversification, thinking about legacy and sustainability, not rapid growth. Remember, Fouquet, the man who threw the lavish party in 1661, his wealth exceeded most of the French nobility. He owned the most beautiful estate in the country, the most extensive network, the most formidable influence. But he took third threshold assets and did something with them he didn't even realize he was doing. He made the king feel threatened. He believed money was absolute security. Money couldn't protect him from political power. He died in prison because he confused capital with an all-purpose shield. Robert Morris made the opposite mistake. He crossed the inversion point cleanly. His assets were generating more than his labor ever could. And then he got overconfident. He started using that existing wealth to speculate heavily on frontier land. When the land bubble burst, he went from one of the wealthiest men in America to a debtor's prison inmate. Died in a boarding house. Forgotten by the country he helped create. The lesson from both stories isn't to avoid acquiring wealth. It is to understand, every time you cross a line, the game changes. The strategy that got you to $100,000 won't carry you to $500,000. The mindset that made you successful at $500,000 will become your biggest liability at $2.5 million. If you don't update your mental model with each threshold, you'll either stall out or you'll personally destroy everything you built. These three lines, $100,000, $500,000, $2.5 million, aren't just numerical targets to check off. They're phase transitions. At these points, the underlying rules of how money works shift fundamentally. The logic that served you at the previous stage simply stops working. 600 years ago, the Medici family figured all of this out through nothing but observation, mathematics, and a way of thinking about money that was completely different from everyone around them. No compound interest calculators, no index funds, no tax advantage retirement accounts. What they had was insight, patience, and a framework for understanding wealth that most people never develop. You know that framework now. The financial industry won't tell you because there is no profit in it for them. Media won't tell you because nuanced truth doesn't get clicks. Your employer won't tell you because your desperation works in their favor. But now you know. The question is what you're going to do with it. If this changed the way you think about money, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me which threshold are you working toward right now. I read every single one. I'm genuinely curious where you are in this journey.